Hatow. She's a PhD student in Erasmus University. She attended the Cancun talks, and she'll be telling us more about this today.
Welcome to the Mahrousa's Green Series, a part of the Green Series that Lama just mentioned, myself, Lama El Hatow. I, as Lama mentioned, attended the COP16 UNFCCC climate negotiations this year in Cancun, and last year I also attended the COP15's negotiations in Copenhagen. I also am a part of an NGO in Beirut called INDIACT, which is basically it's an NGO that works for Arab climate campaigning in the Arab world, and what we do is we work basically on climate policy work and advocacy and lobbying for the negotiators of the Arab world throughout the climate sessions. And so during the intersessionals as well, between each COP, the COP15, COP16, each COP, so we also have intersessionals that we attend where we work on a lot of lobbying. And you'll actually notice that from when I come to go through my lecture, you'll actually notice that sometimes a lot of the work that we actually do in the intersessionals are a lot more valuable than the work that we actually do at the COPs. Simply for the fact that a lot of these COPs are just incredibly chaotic, and it's just sometimes very, very difficult with how politicized it gets to actually get anything achieved and anything done. So, for interest, let's begin. So basically, some of the basics which I'll be going into. Last year, if some of you attended, it was a very, very long lecture, and the Mami basically was very adamant that I try to cut it down as much as possible. So without further ado, I pretty much happened it. So if possible, I'm trying to get everything done within 45 minutes, and you can actually stop me at that point in time if it goes on beyond that. So briefly, I'll go into the global warming basics for those who are new and don't know too much about climate change and global warming. Talk about the impacts of climate change on both a global and on a local level here in Egypt, what's going to be happening. And then talk about the UNFCCC political process. So how do we actually translate what's happening, the climate change impacts, into political ambition and political will on a global level and on a national level. Some of the briefings of the different conventions that have already been happened, and then what happened in Cancun, and finally the way forward. So some of the basics when we talk about global warming, just show of hands. Does everybody in this room have an idea of what global warming is? If you do, please raise your hand. Very good. Okay, so I'll basically just do a very brief then. So as most of you already know, global warming was basically something that was initiated after the Industrial Revolution. In the 1920s, a lot of nations were stirring towards development, and in this pursuit of actually going through it, there was a lot of emissions, obviously, from industrial facilities, cement factories, whatnot, that were actually coming up at rapid rates. So this actually already began in the 1850s and actually piloted a lot more in the 1920s. The amount of CO2 has increased by about 35% from 280 parts per million to around 380 parts per million today. It's actually, this figure is closer to 390 parts per million CO2. So those with a non-technical background, very briefly, the atmosphere, global atmosphere has a threshold in which how much CO2 concentration we can actually withhold in the atmosphere. Basically, in order to not have severe consequences on our planet in terms of climatic impacts, we need to stabilize the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 at 350 ppm. We already today have exceeded that to 380 and actually up to 390 as of today. So as you can see, we're already pushing towards the threshold, towards what we call the tipping point. There's this, what we call sort of a curve, and at one point when we reach the peak or the tipping point, there's irreversible damages that we honestly cannot go back. I'll get into that more. So the greenhouse effect, very, very briefly, as you probably all already know, is when we continue to have CO2 building up in our atmosphere, we create what we call this layer. And this layer is basically this inversion layer. So we have the sun's rays, which come into our globe, which come onto the Earth, and it's actually needed in order to warm our Earth. So the Earth's rays are not necessarily a bad thing, but what happens is that some of these Earth's rays actually can come in and warm the Earth so that we don't freeze over. And some of them are bounced back again, so that again we don't warm up too much. But what happens when we have an increased buildup of CO2, which creates this layer, like a greenhouse effect? That's exactly what it is, the greenhouse effect. When you walk into a greenhouse, it's very stuffy, you can barely sort of breathe. It's a condensed layer. This is what it is. It's this condensed layer of CO2 basically stopping any of the sun's rays from actually exiting and getting the atmosphere. So what enters, most of it actually stays in and very little of it goes out. So what enters bounces back, heating the Earth actually further and further, and that hence the global warming. So there's this global warming paradox. While it produces more evaporation from oceans to fill the warmer atmosphere with increased moisture, it also sucks moisture out of soil, leading to increased desertification. So we talk about the impacts of climate change. What are some of the impacts? We talk about floods, we talk about droughts, and we all know that these are calamities and catastrophes to happen on our Earth. How will this impact us on a national level, for instance? In Egypt, what is our major source of water? The Nile River. The Nile River, one of the greatest impacts that potentially could be happening is that we end up having, with increased temperatures, we have what? Increased evaporation. Simple laws of physics, right? But we know that what goes up must come down in some place. So what goes up in terms of evaporation will actually come down in terms of rainfall, but will it come down in rainfall in Egypt? Absolutely not. It actually, because of the cyclical model, it will actually come down in Ethiopian highlands. So again, this also leads to controversy. Okay, the Ethiopian highlands, as some of you may already know, is one of the sources of the Blue Nile that brings water down further downstream towards Egypt. So does this mean that we will end up having decreased water flow in Egypt because of increased evaporation, hence less water flow and less water for Egyptian civilians? Or will we end up having an increased water flow coming from the Ethiopian highlands towards Egypt with increased flow and possibly flooding the Aswan Dam and possibly all of us altogether? So as you can see, there are two diverging scenarios, and which one will actually happen, we don't actually know. This is one of our biggest dilemmas actually today. Okay, so I have a quick poll I like to do in a lot of these seminars, just to see where everybody stands when we talk about emissions and global emissions. As the world continues to debate global warming, one big question is how to accommodate the increased growth of developing economies like China and India. This raises an interesting question. How many metric tons of greenhouse gases are emitted per person globally each year? Does anybody have an idea? No? Okay. It's about 6.4 metric tons of CO2 a year globally, which is not evenly distributed. And this is actually very interesting because when you talk about not evenly distributed, you'll end up seeing that there are countries like the United States which may end up emitting considerably more, not only on a global level, but as a per capita level, than other nations, for instance, in Africa, even in Egypt. Another quick question. If all the world's nearly 7 billion people contributed as much CO2 as the average American, to what level would the world's population need to shrink to keep the current global level of CO2 unchanged? So what this question really means is that how many planets, basically, do we need in terms of natural resources, in terms of how much do we actually have to reduce in order to actually have sufficient resources and capabilities for our people? So to what level would the world's population need to shrink to keep the current global level of CO2? 1.5 billion. We are currently 7 billion people. We would have to shrink to 1.5 billion. In order to maintain the current global level of CO2, or which is 28.4 billion tons per year, the world population would need to approximately be 1.5 billion if everyone produced as much CO2 as the average American. This figure is about 1/5 of the current world population. So let's talk about the impacts of climate change, both globally and locally. We, as I mentioned, know that climate change is happening from industrial emissions, transportation sector. What's happening? We can see it happening on the northern poles. We can see that there are glaciers are beginning to melt. Sea level rises are happening all over the place. Polar bears are beginning to become extinct because their natural habitats are becoming extinct. There's desertification beginning to happening left and right. Drought is increasing, specifically in Africa and in the tropical regions. You'll end up seeing floods in places that we never had floods before. So what can we begin to do? Temperature increase on Egypt. An increase in the Earth's atmosphere by temperature by 3 to 4 degrees would raise the sea level by approximately 1 meter, creating 6 million refugees in Egypt, which is about with 4,500 square kilometers of agricultural land in the Delta flood.